It's so nice to be here on the stage and with these three people, especially because after we've heard about our desolate, kind of not very encouraging outlook for innovation, I know that we're going to actually hear some really great ideas from the three people here, especially because, you know, if we look back at the Barton report for the federal government about how exactly we can encourage innovation. I mean, it's a little bit easy to get cynical about all of those reports that we've had over the course of the years because we've heard about innovation and the need to improve productivity and competitiveness so many times over the years. And that report singled out your industries one by one as being the future. It's easy to get cynical because we keep hearing these reports, but I think we have an opportunity here to hear exactly what you're doing in your industries and how you've been able to, you know, what caught the attention of Barton at the time and his committee, and then where you've gone since then. So let's go through it a bit. You know, I hope to hear about the trials and tribulations, but also get to, as we've heard here, like we really need to narrow it down and get to some concrete solutions. Let's go through it a little bit. I mean, Jason, should we start with you? Can you tell us a little bit just about how you're pushing innovation and productivity at within your own sector, within your own company? You know, what's working for you right now?
Sure, thank you. So I think the first thing is, you know, I kind of think about innovation in three different buckets. There's product innovation, which I think many of us are familiar with, and I'll give an example in just a moment. There's process innovation, and then there's policy innovation. So those are the three areas that I look at. If you take the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, the product innovation really was the development of vaccines. That was the innovation. That was the end product, the new product that really changed things for us. But behind that, there was process innovation. So mRNA, that was a new technology, a new framework on which these vaccines were based, and other future vaccines will be developed as well. There's also a really great Canadian invention from Peter Cullis that was part of those vaccines, and it's lipid nanoparticle technology. And that technology that was commercialized by a Canadian company, that's the reason those vaccines are able to be delivered into our bodies. Without that, we wouldn't have the vaccines. So there's great Canadian process innovation happening. There's also the policy innovation that took place to get those vaccines to Canadians. And it really took a different approach by regulators to fast track the approval process without skipping any steps for safety and efficacy and get those products to Canadians. So there's a great example where we had all those different types of innovations happening in a coordinated way. So that really made the difference in terms of where we're at now and the fact that we're all here today, able to have this conversation that we're having. I also wanted to say that, you know, there was a comment previously, and I think that was spot on. We're actually quite good at innovation and at creating ideation. Less so on the commercialization. I know we're going to dig into that in a moment. But I really want to end on a positive note. We are at a revolution or a renaissance in life sciences right now. And it's not just mRNA. We have cell and gene therapy. We have AI and machine learning. Health data was mentioned, which is going to be foundational to the future of medicine in this country. And Canada has the opportunity to be leaders in all of these areas, but it's going to take that kind of alignment that we saw with the COVID example in order to realize that full potential.
Okay, thanks for that. And Alison, I'm very interested in hearing about what your experience is in agri-food. I mean, we hear so much about the world needing more in that whole industry, and it seems to me that the only way, I mean, if we've got the only way we're going to get there is by huge leaps in productivity. So what's working for you right now? How are you meeting that demand?
So I'm going to speak from a little different perspective. I'm a founder, and I grew my company, my former company, was an agricultural technology company, essentially a data acquisition and analytics platform, which I built around the world, installed in most of the major agricultural universities, and basically was an overnight success after 30 years of research and development. I sold my company to a UK private wealth firm. Excuse me, I'm having quite a bit of trouble. I've just overcome COVID, so my speaking is not so good at the moment. But what I found is I sold my business. I thought, what a wonderful exit that I had. But then I started thinking about all the tough things that I faced during the time that I was a founder. And there were two things. One, I think if I had better access to capital at a reasonable cost, I would have been much more successful. And secondarily, if I had had experience at the commercialization phase or the scaling phase, I would have been much more successful. And Dean Hodgson mentioned that case study was the impact at Ivy. And I thought, that is exactly what we need, is case study and example and experiential learning if you want to be a successful entrepreneur. So I picked up golf, hated it, and then decided that what I had to do was go and think about what could I do to make things better. The first thing I did is I went down to Silicon Valley, became a venture capitalist, invested in funds around the world, and said, okay, why don't we have this ecosystem of capital in Canada? The second thing that I did was I looked for commercialization experience and thought I wanted to become a mentor. I found the Creative Destruction Lab, which I think is one of our best examples in Canada of assisting entrepreneurs to success. And I invested personally and stood up the agricultural stream at Creative Destruction Lab, and the agricultural stream is a global stream. We have involvement from business schools around the world, mentors who have scaled their companies effectively and exited successfully. And basically, we are trying to build a program that over 8 months helps entrepreneurs get through that scaling phase. In terms of agriculture, our opportunity in Canada is immense. We are the 5th largest exporter of commodity goods in the world. We are the 8th exporter of agribusiness products. And I always use this statistic because the 2nd largest in the world is the Netherlands, which is the size of Banff National Park. So we must stop being extractors of resources. We must begin being creators of value-added product. And agriculture, look, we've got a serious problem. With the geopolitical conflict that we have with 2 agricultural superpowers duking it out, Canada is in a unique opportunity, has a unique opportunity to expand and become literally the breadbasket of the world once again. We once were, we can again.
Thank you. So Flavio, I think did I once call you an innovation superhero or something like that?
I like that. You didn't say that, but I'll take it. You said it now. Everybody heard you.
I think this was during the days of COVID when you were, well, the early days when you were coming up with all sorts of ideas about how to switch up the production lines. And I think those are some of the stories we know quite well. But now that you're a little bit back to normal and not working in an industry that's producing face masks so much as auto parts, can you tell us what's working for you in terms of boosting productivity, especially in terms of, I mean, there is huge change going through your industry right now. You're going to have to switch completely over to electric from conventional.
Thanks for the easy one. I worked with Jason years ago with Mahmoud. In that time there, I think, we were asking the same questions, and we asked the same questions. Perrin asked the same question he probably asked when he first showed up in Ottawa. And we asked the same questions because we have the same fundamental dynamics in the Canadian economy that we did 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. A lot of time has been spent talking about what the 70s looked like. I don't want to tell you what I was doing in the 70s. But I use that as a segue to say, I agree with everything they've said about how we're looking at what is innovation in our sectors and what does it mean. In the car sector, innovation is not technology. I know I'm the wrong guy to be saying that, especially for who I represent. But electric vehicles are, raise your hand if you had a remote control car when you were a kid. Some of you did. You have a fan moving air in your room. That's an electric motor. The New York City cab company's biggest supplier of vehicles in the 1910s was Detroit Electric. Connected autonomous technology is not new. A remote control car when it was in the 80s. Driving them around, it's the same thing. It's about posture. Every jurisdiction in the world is saying we need to get to zero-emission vehicles by the 2030s. Joe Biden said 50% by 2030. Justin Trudeau said 100% by 2035 on new sales. It's not going to happen. It can't happen. I'll get to that in a minute. Every car company in the world is tripping over themselves and saying, well, I'm making an electric vehicle. No, I'm making an electric vehicle. I have them, and there's one for you, and one for you, and one for you, and they're all going to make them. It's table stakes. Connected autonomous is table stakes. Where does Canada weigh? What's our place in this? You call me a manufacturing hero.
Oh, yeah.
and it was just about posture difference. So when the pandemic hit, I talked to some of our friends, Mahmoud, who were in procurement in Ontario and Canada, and said, do we have sources of PPEs and ventilators? The world's falling apart, and our major trading partners are saying, export bans. Where are we going to get it from? And so what we simply said was, there's about 1,400 factories in our group. Can we make that stuff? Could you give us the specs? Can you tell us the volumes you need? We'll just go ahead and do it. Everybody said we're nuts. Well, we probably were nuts, but we're giving it a shot. In about 4 weeks, we started what I call, objectively, the greatest mobilization of the industrial base in Canada in peace times. And so we covered that first gap. Car parts makers, like bashers of metal and melters of plastic. But the innovation was, how are we going to look at this differently? How are we going to look at a problem differently? And we're going to put ourselves out there. We're not incentivized to put ourselves out there. It's not. Parts makers say, by the way, Ford says, I want to buy your cup holder. I'm going to pay you 3 cents. And when the check shows up, it's 2.9 cents. We don't drive that innovation. But maybe we should. And I'll get into it in a moment, or maybe a little bit later in here. It's been 100 years since we had a Canadian car maker. And I went to all those NAFTA renegotiation rounds, every single one of them. I shouldn't have been there, Tom. We talked during that. What's the trade association for the parts suppliers doing, negotiating in public? It was a different posture. We knew what we wanted. We went and said it to the people who are accountable to the newspapers they read. We said, we want these rules. This is what you'd get in return. And we'll keep making it more difficult for you to do it. And at all those tables and at the TPP tables, Canada was at a disadvantage because we didn't have a car company. And so the final rules on TPP were heavily influenced by Toyota, who's a great investor in Canada, heavily influenced by General Motors, even though the U.S. didn't sign up, and same thing in the NAFTA table. We said it's been 100 years since Canada has had a car company. We have the technology, we have the people, lots of reasons. We'll get into them, why we don't have a car company. We decided that we're going to build a 100% Canadian designed, engineered, supplied concept prototype, which we're going to show to the world first week of January, called Project Arrow. We named it after the arrow. Somebody said, well, I hope it doesn't have the same fate. Well, I guess if we don't try, we know it will. And why do we do it? Because we want to demonstrate that if we do things differently with the brains and the technology we have, maybe we can move that innovation needle a little bit. If we don't try things differently, we're going to ask that same question Perrin asked. I'll be the guy asking it 30 years from now.
So we're hearing a lot about, there's the positivity, the creativity, the fast track, and there's a lot of dynamism. Okay, but there's the big but, right? We're economy-wide, we're not seeing that commercialization happening at the pace that we would expect, given our R&D, given our ambition. What do you see? I mean, you're all in very successful areas, so it's going to be harder to find out what the impediments are from your examples of success. But what do you see standing in the way of getting to that, in your own sectors, getting to that level where, okay, you're on fire, you're leading the world in terms of your innovation? Who wants to start with that one? Go ahead.
I think we lack some imagination. We need to compete to win. And I think we have to have a bias for action. And I think coming from a founder's perspective, taking your company, growing it around the world, you just do it. And I think that we have so many different policy discussions. We get very happy by the end of the day, and we go home and we say, wow, we did a great job, but we didn't get things done. The economic strategy table set some goals that I thought were very light. We actually had conversations about what can we achieve given what we're producing. And we have not met those goals. We also haven't tracked those goals. We haven't looked to see what our performance was against the goals and objectives we set. There are two things, if you're a scaling innovator, that we lack, and that is a good spectrum of capital in Canada. Access to capital at a reasonable cost. We also must, as innovators, not rely on the government for our funding. A $140 million grant that goes across multiple countries, multiple companies across the country is not sufficient. A life sciences company probably needs $140 million to get off the ground. So what we have to do is we have to attract foreign investment that invests here. We must create incentives and policy action to provide tax credits. And we also have to look at our companies and say, if you expend or you spend on research and development, business expenditures on research and development, we will give you a tax credit. It will be a level playing field. You become as automated as you can be. And in that way, we will see innovation being adopted, automation being accepted. And in agriculture, we need to be a digital society. We need internet connectivity across Canada. Rural and northern Canada does not have connectivity. Estonia is one of the most digitally enabled societies. It's a small country. We need to start looking at the things that we're lacking, and we need to invest.
Okay, go ahead, Jason. I'd be interested to hear specifically too in life sciences. What are you seeing as the impediment to that big leap forward?
Yeah, so first I want to pick up on some of your comments, Alison, around access to capital, because that is a challenge in our sector as well in terms of the scale-up issue and the scale-up. And I believe that there is actually a lot of capital that's not being tapped into. So yes, attracting foreign capital is important, but accessing the capital that we have here at home is also important. We do pretty well in venture, but there are other areas of capital like our public capital markets, and we've seen very innovative policies like flow-through shares that have helped other sectors in natural resources. We don't have those available in knowledge-based sectors like life sciences. Our pension funds, Quebec pension funds have done very well investing in life sciences. We haven't seen the same level of investment from Ontario pension funds. We need to be able to tap into those. So access to capital is certainly an important element. But I think the biggest challenge that we face in life sciences is something that was part of the questions earlier on with our first speaker, and that's our culture in Canada around health and health products. I think if you surveyed 10 Canadians, the majority of them will tell you that we have the best health system in the world and it's absolutely free. And neither of those things are true. So that creates a bit of a problem, right? When we're talking and trying to talk about innovative policies around health. And it's almost like when you read on social media some commentaries and they eventually degrade down into name calling. The same thing happens with policy discussions around healthcare. Eventually, and it's agnostic of whatever political party, eventually whoever's trying to have that conversation will get criticized for privatization. It always comes down to that as like the lowest common denominator. So that impedes, I think, our progress around health policy innovation, and that needs to be addressed. Again, I'm not sure what the solution is there, but that to me is one of the biggest challenges we face.
Okay, thanks. So, okay, let's talk about automotive. So we're not facing that cultural impediment or the public sector mentality in the auto sector. Clearly, what stands in the way of the great big commercialization?
How do you define a leader in the automotive sector? We always say we're the 10th biggest automotive jurisdiction in the world, but we don't have a car maker. If you take the North American map of manufacturing and you overlay it on the North American map of IT and the North American map of critical minerals required for electrification in automotive, the only place those three intersect with the globally relevant clusters are in Ontario, and let's drill a little bit into Quebec. How do you drive a Canadian automotive sector? Well, either you decide that you're going to be a Silicon Valley type startup jurisdiction where Teslas come out of. Okay, that's a really big industrial policy conversation. Mm-hmm. Or you decide that movement into connected autonomous technology, applications of AI and machine learning in the fleet and in the infrastructure that then helps us to monetize data, you're going to invest in that space. In that space, we're a country that has the U.S. gets about 25 times the venture capital per capita compared to Canada in this space. How do you get that foreign investment? A lot of the venture cap, the biggest portion of venture cap in Canadian automotive technology or related technology is American. So we used to have LSIFs in Ontario that when we phased them out in 2011, 2012, a lot of the companies in this space said, please don't do that. It was flawed, but don't get out of risk capital. We don't have this risk culture here. And so they take what we've built here and go to Silicon Valley and risk on a Tesla-like launch. What's the world that we compete in? At TPP, we said the US and Japan are the big auto companies, but Canada and Mexico are pretty close. We make a lot of cars here. Don't worry about Vietnam or Malaysia. I said then, you don't worry about Vietnam and Malaysia today. But here we are 7 years later, there's a company called VinFast. It's selling cars in Canada this year. Great cars, designed by Pininfarina, who is helping us on Project Arrow. This is a group of suppliers and technologies and companies that came together with the help of the industrial policy in Vietnam to be an auto player. The Turks, it's not a inconsequential economy, but maybe 20th, 21st in the world. They did the same thing. Yes, they have an egotistical leader who decided that he wanted to have a car company and fund the car company through industrial policy to say how great they are. But the end result is we're competing with a Turkish car company now called TOG, designed by Pininfarina, built by Magna Steyr. Okay, it is this global world where we are competing against industrial policy. The Chinese are winning in automotive because they have a 4,000-year arc on return on investment. Great, but it's the reality. Like, if you want to be in that space, you got to beat them. Bloomberg NEF last week rated Canada as the #2 source for EV supply chain in the world. Well, here's number 1. Here's number 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. We've done a lot of good things, but we are 36 to 72 months away from making cells in this country, and we don't have an OEM here, a car maker, that drives some industrial policy decisions that are Canadian. We have great car companies here, 3 Japanese and 2 American ones, that when it gets tough, when the going gets tough, they make decisions in Tokyo and in Dearborn and Detroit and wherever Stellantis makes their decisions these days in Paris. We're in a new world where we have new competition, and our old competition, like Washington, is putting $180 billion into this space. So we celebrated a win. The Build Back Better bill that was proposed said there was going to be EV tax credits for cars only made in the U.S., even though our system is based on we make 2 million cars a year, 85% of them get sold to the Americans. It was going to kill us. We got that changed in the new Inflation Reduction Act. Then they snuck in there a battery manufacturing credit that's probably worth $1 to $1.5 billion a year to a battery manufacturer in the U.S. a year. Not the initial CapEx, OpEx. We're in that world. And we can't be Boy and Girl Scouts about it when we say the public sector doesn't belong in that space. It probably doesn't in a pure model. But nothing is pure about the models in which, with whom we compete with. So we're either in or we're out. And the innovative part of that is just be candid about it. We're going to compete with the Chinese, and we've got to make some decisions.
So, okay, we're dancing around industrial policy talk here, and let's drill down on that a little bit. So, and I wish I could say, industry could just do it all on its own. I think probably as a country, we've been talking about this for a long time. What does the government need to do? Or what has been your experience with the government so far that has actually helped take you to a higher level? And how does that fit into with an industrial policy? I mean, we keep talking about industrial policy, and there's certainly a lot of money out there. There are a lot of incentives. There's a lot of tax measures. Like so many of them that they're pretty hard to keep track of, from my perspective. Are they actually? Talk to me about what has actually worked, and how does that fit in with a broader actual strategy coming from the government to help you guys and your cohorts? Go take it further. Okay, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah. So, when COVID hit, it shone a bright spotlight in terms of a lot of gaps in Canadian biomanufacturing and our lack of domestic capacity. It shone a bright spotlight in gaps in our health systems as well. And the government has responded, right? They had to. I mean, we were in crisis. And a lot of good work happened. I gave some examples about, the regulatory bodies that were streamlining approvals of vaccines. And we now actually have a biomanufacturing and life sciences strategy here in Canada. But we didn't have one before. And that is the reason why we were caught a little bit short when the pandemic hit. We didn't have an industrial policy. This was a sector that was neglected for decades. So for me going forward, it's great that we have these strategies now in place, but we can't let the last symptom of COVID-19 be amnesia. We have to continue to invest. We have to have sustainable investment. We don't know where the next health crisis is going to be, and we don't know what the technologies are that are going to be the solutions. Mm-hmm. So this needs to have that continual investment and consistent investment over time. So I think we're on the right track. We've got a good start. And, in our conversations with the federal government, they seem to be understanding that. But at the same time, there are other parts of government that are misaligned with that approach. So, for example, one of the biggest challenges we face is that economic policy and health policy are treated separately. And so we have a situation right now with the Patented Medicine Pricing Review Board that is completely devaluing innovation. It's causing delays to new medicines coming to Canada, and it needs to be addressed. It's certainly working against the efforts that are happening around the life sciences strategy. It's kind of like pushing the gas pedal and the brake at the same time. So we need better alignment around those health policies and economic policies. We've certainly learned from COVID-19, there's no economic security without health security. So let's line these things up.
This is such a Canadian conversation.
I know. Yeah. Well,
we have strategy, but we don't have capacity. And I think that's something that we really have to consider. You might have a great strategy. Let's really look at what happened during the pandemic. Yes, we lacked the manufacturing capacity, but we also had the technology sitting on the shelf. CDL launched a program called Recovery, where we opened up to the world to say, here, bring us your solutions. Almost every solution to several things, from testing through to you name it, that could help during COVID. There wasn't one thing that was just that brilliant light bulb. They had been sitting on the shelf for years and had been underinvested. So I think we have to have, once again, I draw back to bias for action. I think we have a lot of strategies. I think we also have to be quite honest with ourselves in, we can't have every industry in the world here. Where are our strengths? Where do we invest? And I would disagree with you that we have a good VC market. We don't. We have a venture capital market that is basically funded by the same government organizations. We're not creating new capital. I'll tell you that 65% of our wealth in Canada by 2030 is going to be invested in women. Women will hold 65% of the capital. We do not activate the capital from our private wealth. We have 15% of our economic wealth sitting in pension funds. Where do pension funds in Canada invest? If you take a look at the recent investments from CPPIB, they are investing in worldwide companies, which is great, if the returns are there, but the infrastructure is being built elsewhere. So what we need to do is really look at our spectrum of capital, and Flavio said the same thing. Access to capital at a reasonable cost is like fundamental. The other side is also access to talent. And we can't let our talent, there was a couple of questions, we cannot let our talent leave Canada. We must attract talent here. So that's creating a whole different kind of ecosystem, building on the strategy.
So, okay, I hope you can pick up on this a bit, Flavia. So if we have great ideas, which we do, and we have, there's nothing, there is capital, maybe not as much as we want, but there's capital out there sitting with the pension funds, as you said, Alison. Why is it that when an investor goes to invest, beyond the ideas, to take it to that action level that you mentioned, Alison, why is it that the bias is to go elsewhere? I mean, we've got the price signals, we've got the ideas, we've got the money, but we're missing that piece. Why is that?
In our business, we don't have a pull market in Canada. So it's a 2 million car market out of 100 million cars in the world. But the Americans have 17% of that global market. The Europeans have 21%, the Chinese have 33%. So if you're going to take a shot at something, and these are big, bulky products, they don't ship well, and they don't ship cheaply. So you're going to eat your margins. A good company operates in our space 6 to 9% EBITDA. So you're going to eat that by moving in places. So you don't do things in Canada where your best test market is southwestern Ontario and the Golden Horseshoes. Because you can do so much more somewhere else. And on a per capita basis, we probably would be the 35th to 39th U.S. state. The top selling car in this country is a Honda Civic. The top selling car in the U.S. is a Ford F-150. It's really difficult to turn around and say, Canada has a specific return value that isn't present somewhere else. We just I think, I'll go back to the same point I keep making. We need to, if we decide as a country there's a value in the industry that I'm in, that's an if. We pick our lanes, because we can't be everything. and then we take some chances. We don't have a culture of taking some chances in this country, Avro-Arrow. And we don't have a culture of celebrating that individual or individuals who take those risks. We don't protect them with the tax regime, and we certainly don't protect them with the way we profile risk from long-term investment holdings. It's an attitude change. And it might be generational. It might be the boomers helped turn this country into a strong, independent G7 country. You know, it wasn't that long ago that we passed the Treaty of Westminster. It wasn't that long ago we followed the British into war. So we've changed the footing. I know everybody talks about millennials, but I think there's that in-between generation that's get gray hair in their beards or on their heads now, and their kids are teenagers now, and they're getting into those C-suite roles and say, well, what are you bringing to the equation now? If we have a shrinking labor market, there's less of you. How are you going to make a bigger impact? And who are the industrial captains who are then going to have outsized political influence? Who are the political champions that are going to take a few Canadian risks so that we can say, this company, the next BlackBerry, there's a lot of good to be said about what BlackBerry and Nortel did for this country, or our country's brand 20 years ago. Who's the next one? What is it? And then let's get behind them.
Okay, I don't want to pick winners.
Project Arrow.
Okay. I'm really concerned when we try to pick winners. We've failed at that over several years. What I really want to do, and you said something very intelligent, as did you, in that you expressed that we have IP. Let's set the difference between invention and innovation. Innovation is bringing our product to market. Invention is our patents, our publications, which we are so very good at. Can we start capitalizing on our intellectual property? We may not build cars here, but we certainly can have the intellectual property and the components of it, which we can protect. We do not protect our IP well here. Talking about flow-through shares, could we be highly creative in creating flow-through shares that monetizes and puts IP on our balance sheets? We have to start thinking about what kind of nation we are, and we can be an intellectual property nation. We're not big enough to be the biggest market on earth, but we definitely can be the absolute brightest, fund that intelligence, and grow markets globally.
Okay, so I love where you're taking us, because I want to, we have instructions. We must come up with solutions. We can't leave here until we come up with solutions. So, okay, so you've come up with two for us. So better protection of intellectual property and flow through shares so you can monetize them on your balance sheet. What else? What else, like precisely what else can we do?
Yeah,
Jason.
So I want to add just one comment to what Flavio said about those made in Canada success stories. So just to put it in context, the three largest biotech companies listed on the NASDAQ, that's Amgen, Gilead, and Moderna right now, their combined market cap is bigger than the entire Canadian oil and gas sector combined. 136 companies listed on the TSX-V. Just to put it in perspective. Mm-hmm. And they're not companies that are 100 years old. These are companies that are decades old, built on good science, which Canada has in spades. So that's the potential, right? That's the opportunity. In terms of those actionable policy items, get rid of the PMPRB. It's a defunct body. It doesn't serve any purpose. It's doing more harm than good. So get rid of that. Facilitate better access to capital. I think we've talked to at length. And just to clarify my comments about VC, it's not that we can always use more VC. I agree with you 100% on that.
Better VC.
I just find that most of the conversations around access to capital revolve around VC, and we have to realize that there's actually other sources there as well, like the flow-through shares in our public capital markets, like pension funds, and I just find they don't get the airtime as much. So that's why I made the comments I made. And then the third thing is we've heard a lot of discussions right now about the federal health data framework. That needs to happen. That is going to be fundamental foundation on the future of medicine in this country. It has so many benefits. We need to get that right. And so maybe a little bit like boiling the ocean, but that's one we should do.
Okay, Flavia, how are you going to change the world?
In our business, you've got to pick winners and losers because all of our competition does. Commit to fomenting all of the different elements that are great for connected, autonomous, zero-emission vehicles that exist here at a level and a confluence that doesn't exist anywhere else in North America. And say in the auto business, you want to create the conditions for car maker startups. In that space, the kids who come after me will not just be making car parts and tools and all the systems in there. They'll be making transportation and climate decisions around the world because they're in boardrooms that matter when you go to trade discussions and when you're creating wealth.
Okay, so we've got a list here, and I just want to, we're out of time too, and do I have time for questions? Take a couple? Okay, but I just wanted to also put out there too, that you're all talking about culture and cultural barriers, which, I mean, better intellectual property and you know, very, very finely tuned, you know, policies here and there could tweak things. But if we are dealing with a cultural issue on many levels that makes us complacent, you know, that's a big problem that may not be able to change with tax policy. So I'll just put that out there. Let's take a couple of questions and then we'll sum it up. Okay, go ahead, right here.
I'll just pick up on your culture point, which I'll say is changing the culture is top down, bottom up. And we really need to celebrate innovation and declare ourselves a country of innovation. We have never done that. And I always say this, many of you have heard me say this, poor old Banting and Best. It took 100 years to give Banting a little statue in recognition of the discovery of insulin that was here in Canada, company spun out of the University of Toronto, Connaught Labs. And this is what we do, and this is what we still do. We don't celebrate innovation. You know, we were kind of the last to celebrate the big component of Peter Cullis's technology that went into producing vaccines. So I think it's a collective in changing the culture, and it's everybody's job to do that.
Any comments from up here on that? It
agree.
seems to be a fairly fun solution. We just celebrate our success.
I can just say amen. But I also think that we have to be much more agile. And I think agility, if agility was our superpower from regulation through to financing, I think that would be something that would get us further down the road. I like being nice, but I think I'd rather be agile.
Do we have one final question? I guess, how about at the back there?
So going to the IP discussion, we've seen that there's a lot of government initiatives to help Canadian businesses identify and protect their IP resources. But from a federal government perspective, how can we mitigate the risk of IP leakage, as we talked about firms taking IP that's developed in Canada and protected in Canada, but then moving to foreign countries with that intellectual property?
Okay, that's a very technical question. Who has an answer? Go ahead.
It all comes back to capital. The reason you're having that leakage is because they're chasing money. That's it, right? So you fix the capital issue, you're going to fix the IP issue. And you cannot, like, it drives me a little bit crazy. You cannot force people to keep their IP here. It's not going to work, right?
Yes, you can.
I don't think you can, because look, it's a global marketplace, right? You can put some strings attached and stuff, but if the capital's here, I know a lot of entrepreneurs that are very proud Canadians. They developed IP in Canada. They wanted to keep their companies here and scale, and they were beat down by their boards to go to the U.S. because that's where the capital was.
Keeping your IP here does not mean you can't grow globally. So that's a bit of a conversation that we'll have to have afterwards.
Sure.
But keeping your IP in a country is something that you can do. You can defend your IP territory. You can have a global response to IP. We have to put a priority on it. You can grow your company globally, but you can protect it from here. And this is actually where we'll get our economic growth. So I'd love to have that conversation with anyone. I have protected my IP first in the United States. Then I came back into Canada. Let's make sure that everyone in the world is protecting their IP here first. That's changed some laws, changed some thoughts.
I'll just leave one last example specific to your question. We built a $25 million concept prototype, meaning that it is compliant with Canadian motor vehicle safety standards for 2025, not a clay model, science experiment, chicken wire. About 75% of the cost was in R&D and in engineering and design, none of which is eligible for participation in innovation funding provided by the federal government. The stuff that is eligible is the CapEx, which I can find in other sources. So the federal government is not necessarily a partner in later stage development. And we found the money because we're doing it as an industry demonstration project. But if I did this as an individual, I'd be taking $25 million and throwing it against the wall.
Maybe add one more comment on the IP issue. And, you know, I had an opportunity to actually travel to Israel a few years back with Ian, actually. And we were visiting a lot of university and research institutes at the time. And every single one of them started the conversation off with, this is our IP policy in terms of, you know, the shared ownership from academic labs, government supported, and in the US they have the Bayh-Dole Act that defines that. In Canada, it's a bit of the Wild West, right? Every academic institute and tech transfer office has their own policies. So possibly a framework that defines that clearly could also support, you know, transition of IP and commercialization.
Okay, we're out of time. Thank you for your concrete thoughts, especially, and thank you also for your enthusiasm just to bring us great ideas and make a lot of money at the same time.